August is not usually a big month for politics, but don't tell that to the candidates running for U.S. Senate in New Hampshire. Even though we're still more than a year out from the first votes being cast in that race, the top contenders are out and about, holding events and trying to win support. The lone Democrat running joins us this morning, Congressman Chris Pappas. Thanks for coming in.
Adam, great to see you.
So since we last spoke, you've gained some company in this race, a couple of candidates on the Republican side. Let's first start with your assessment of former Ambassador and former U.S. Senator Scott Brown. Do you treat him as your most likely opponent?
Well, look, I'm running to earn the trust of the people of New Hampshire myself. So I'm out there connecting with folks every day about the issues of concern to them and how we can stand up for what's right at this moment, push back against the Trump administration where they're wrong on tariffs, on this big, ugly bill that's hurting health care delivery in New Hampshire, and on so many other issues of concern, and fighting to figure out how we can push an agenda that's going to lower costs meaningfully for the people of New Hampshire. Now, Scott Brown and the other candidate, Dan Innes, are both every day trying to impress Donald Trump. They're treating this as another episode of Donald Trump's reality show and are pushing hard to get his endorsement because they feel like that's the way they're going to navigate a Republican primary in this day and age. The fact is they're estranged from the people of New Hampshire when it comes to their opposition to the big ugly bill, their opposition to tariffs, their urgency around the need to lower costs, things that the Trump administration aren't doing. And both of them are campaigning to be another vote for Donald Trump in the United States Senate. Fact is, we need people that are going to be checks and balances right now and are going to speak up loudly and clearly for the people of New Hampshire. So I'm not sure how this race is going to pan out, but they're clearly focused on getting one person's attention, Donald Trump's. I'm out there talking to the people of New Hampshire every day, and I hope to earn their trust.
You already mentioned Dan Innes. You know, it could be an interesting twist on this race. I think if he's the nominee, this could be the first time in American history you have two openly gay candidates, Republican and Democrat, running against each other. Obviously, someone could fact check that, but probably the case. Does that change the race at all for you at all, or is it the same thing as you're saying, either guy?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I'm running based on my values, my connection to the people of New Hampshire, the work that I've been doing on behalf of them over the last 6 years in Congress, whether it's speaking out for small businesses, doing work on behalf of the veterans in New Hampshire, making sure that we're truly making this economy work for everyone by investing in the middle class and working to lower costs for granite staters. So that's the agenda that I bring to the table, and I'll be happy to talk with any of these candidates about where I stand on the issues and have a robust debate about the future. This should be about who's going to speak out for New Hampshire, who's going to put the needs of our state first in a very divided political climate in Washington where we have extremism and corporate power that's running amok, where we have an administration that's blowing through all the guardrails, that is pushing an agenda that's inconsistent with what people want to see accomplished here in New Hampshire and is not meeting the challenges that they face in their day-to-day lives. So this has got to be about someone who's going to put New Hampshire first. I can do that, and I look forward to this debate.
In the U.S. Senate, Bernie Sanders just got about half the Democratic caucus to vote in favor of a resolution blocking about $675 million in arms sales to Israel. Senator Shaheen, who you're looking to succeed, was a no vote, joining Sanders on that. Senator Hassan was, I'm sorry about it, Senator Shaheen was a yes vote, joining Senator Sanders. Senator Hassan was a no vote. If you were in the Senate, how would you have voted on that resolution?
Well, clearly right now, there is a moral obligation that the United States has to innocent civilians that are caught in harm's way in Gaza. And I've been consistent in calling for greater humanitarian aid to open that aperture so that the aid is flowing in to the folks that need it right now. But the reports of starvation, of folks going hungry in Gaza, it's just intolerable, and we have to do something about it. So I believe that the administration has the leverage they need to be able to push aid organizations, partners in the region, the Israeli government to do better, and that's what should be happening right now at this moment. So I've been signing letters, I've been working with colleagues across both sides of the aisle to force this issue, to talk about what we can do to respond to the need for humanitarian aid in Gaza. I'll continue to stay focused on that.
How would you vote on that resolution, though?
Well, right now I believe that we need to see a ceasefire develop. And so this is not something that would have effectuated that conversation either way. I would have opposed these resolutions because I believe that we should be holding Hamas to account and realizing a future for the Palestinian people that is not under the thumb of Hamas, but where they have freedom and security, just like the Israeli people deserve as well. And so negotiating this ceasefire, making sure that the Trump administration is getting parties to the table to get a deal done that can realize a cessation of hostilities, get the hostages back home, get the aid in. That's really what we want to see right now, and that's where the focus should be.
Your fellow Democrat and Congressman Ro Khanna is leading an effort in the House to recognize a Palestinian state. Are you on board with that?
Well, that has been offered to the Palestinian Authority in the past. They've rejected it. So I think it's really important to think about what comes next. Once this war ends, what's the future like? And I believe that the Palestinian people deserve self-determination and a state. I support a two-state solution where a Palestinian state can exist peacefully alongside Israel, but they have to recognize the state of Israel as a Jewish democratic homeland. And we do have to recognize that Israel is an enduring ally of the United States. They're the only democracy in the region at this point. We've got to make sure that we're providing them the support to be able to defend themselves against Iran and Iran-backed groups, including terrorist organizations like Hamas. But absolutely, we should be engaging with partners in the region to figure out how we create more stability and peace for the future. That should include a Palestinian state.
Clearly, the line has been crossed for Senator Shaheen, who your attempt to succeed. What about for you? What line could Israel cross? Is there anything they could do that would lose your support?
Well, I have criticism of the Israeli government, and I think there should be room for us to be able to criticize a friend and close ally. The fact is, it doesn't appear that there are any achievable objectives left with respect to the war that they're waging in Gaza. So that's one of the reasons why we need a cessation of hostilities and an ability to get the hostages back home and the aid into the Palestinian people.
The big, beautiful bill you've taken to calling the big, ugly law now that it's in effect. A lot of your events around the state recently have focused on the impact of the cuts to Medicaid and how that's going to affect granted staters. Regarding the Medicaid work requirements being put on the states, why is it wrong to ask able-bodied adults with no children to work a few hours a week in order to receive their benefits?
Well, I think people should work. Folks should be in the workforce if they're able to. And we've got a lot of people that are working in New Hampshire right now and are also enrolled in Medicaid. The fact is New Hampshire tried to construct a work requirement program in the past. It failed to be able to deploy it. We've seen this happen in other states where the administrative burden of developing something like this is incredibly costly and burdensome for a state's Medicaid program, but it doesn't actually get more people participating in the labor force. So I've heard directly from folks with disabilities, people who are caregivers about their concerns around how this could be structured. So that's, I think, where the conversation needs to be, how we make sure that healthcare continues to be able to go to those folks that need it, whether it's people that are struggling with disabilities, folks that are caring for others, people in long-term care. And we're going to see drastic cuts as a result of the legislation that was passed that's supported by the Republicans running for United States Senate in this particular race. So I think this is going to be an important conversation to have. We're working hard to mitigate the damage from this bill, but I've heard it directly from hospitals here in Manchester, across the state, from our long-term care facilities. They're really concerned about what this means in terms of cuts to health care and the ability to just give people the help that they deserve. And we're all going to pay a higher bill as a result of increased premiums when the uncompensated care at hospitals goes up, and that's going to be passed along to people who have private insurance.
In April, you spoke out in Washington alongside your fellow Democrats in favor of the Equality Act, which covers a lot of different LGBTQ issues, but notably would also include gender identity in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Do you see the current battle over transgender rights, in access to what are so-called traditional women's spaces to play in women's sports, do you see that as being on a par with fighting Jim Crow segregation in the South in the 60s?
Well, I think when you take a step back and you ask people about equality, they believe that there should be a level of fairness, that everyone should be equal before the law, have the same rights and responsibilities. And so that's what the Equality Act would achieve. We've actually passed that, non-discrimination protections for people regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity in New Hampshire. It was done on a bipartisan basis just a few years ago. And so this national law is modeled after what New Hampshire has already done, and which I think is also a value that people live here in New Hampshire. This is the live free or die state. People have a live and let live attitude about their neighbors. They want them to be supported. And so that's what this is asking for. Nothing more and nothing less than anyone else has, just equality before the law.
Hey, when you look at these two movements side by side, though, you know, you talk about public accommodations and look back to someone like Rosa Parks. Her story resonates. She refused to go back to the back of the bus. People instantly comprehend the unfairness and the injustice of that situation. But when people hear of a man who identifies as a woman wanting to use a women's locker room, they don't have the same reaction. They don't have the same feeling. Why do you think that is?
Well, look, I mean, I think people in New Hampshire do believe that everyone should be able to cut their own path. You do you. You be yourself. And we know we're better off as a society when people can be themselves. Now, there are a lot of issues around this that have been debated in state legislatures, in Congress, but I think we should stay focused on what truly counts right now. Making sure there's a baseline level of equality, that there are legal protections for people, and let's get on to talking about the issues that are of most concern to folks that I talk to every day, whether it's health care, whether it's the cost of housing, the availability of child care, the protection of our environment. These are going to be the issues that are front and center in the upcoming campaign and things that I'm going to continue to be focused on in the House.
And yet a lot of swing voters, a lot of working class voters are losing support for the Democratic Party because they feel Democrats are focusing overly on the issues rather than the cost of living issues. You know, it doesn't sound like there's going to be a lot of a course correction from those things that lost a lot of Democratic seats in the White House in 2024. And you're going to have a seat in the U.S. Senate potentially until 2033 if you win. So you're looking at something like immigration, which is another issue which hurt Democrats, their positions there. Take us through what you're going to do in the U.S. Senate if there's a Democratic president in the future and they want to go back to the Biden-era border and immigration policies.
Well, I don't want to play political pundit here, but let me say this. We were able to win a significant victory in the 1st District last year because we're able to build a coalition of Republicans, independents, and Democrats that trust the leadership that I've been providing, which at times has been critical of the Biden administration, of my own party. And I think you have to keep it real, whether it's on immigration, on the economy, on the issues that people live each and every day and are deeply concerned with. So we were able to overperform the top of the ticket by 6 points in our congressional district, meaning a lot of folks who voted for Trump also voted for me. With respect to the issue around immigration, I think we absolutely have to have a safe and secure border. I was someone who called for that during the Biden administration, pushed them around the end of Title 42 to be prepared for the surge at the border. It took them years into that administration to actually put forward executive policies that began to create the kind of safe, orderly process that we needed throughout that administration. But I believe we should, beyond just focusing on the border and investments in security, which are essential, we've got to be talking about immigration as a value, as a need to be able to grow our economy and ensure that this country can continue to innovate. And that's where the Trump administration is missing the mark. And you see this borne out in the polls where people don't trust him on an issue that was a strong suit for him in the last election because they see him disrespecting civil liberties in this country, where people are not being afforded due process, where they recognize that we need immigrants in this country. They help build this country into what it is today. And here in New Hampshire, employers need folks who are going to be able to work and take jobs in key industries where they're members of our community. So I think there's a way to talk about this by embracing the need to invest in border security, but also making sure that we're modernizing our immigration laws and achieving the kind of reform that's going to meet the needs of our economy and communities and be consistent with our values.
Really quick before we wrap up, Scott Brown, when he attacks you, he's trying to link you to this Democratic socialist running for mayor in New York City, Zohran Mamdani. This is happening around the country. Republicans are making these attacks on Democratic candidates. Do you want to see Mamdani win in New York?
Well, first, Scott Brown is pathetic in terms of how he's running this campaign. Folks here in New Hampshire know that I'm a New Hampshire Democrat. I'm someone who works across the aisle, rated as the most bipartisan Democrat in the House of Representatives last year. So that's the kind of person I am, and people understand who I am and the brand that I have as a local small business owner, someone who understands this state. The fact is, I don't know what's going to go on in New York City. What I'm focused on is what's happening right here in New Hampshire, how we can get out there and earn the trust of the people of the state, listen to them about their day-to-day concerns, and turn that into policies that can make a difference. That's what this campaign's about.
All right, Congressman Pappas, thanks for joining us on Close Up. We'll see you out there on the trail.
Thanks, Adam.